All right, I'm going to talk about a kind of an odd subject, but it's one that really interests me. And that is just the relationship between gunpowder and governments. And you might not have thought that gunpowder was a world-changing, government-changing kind of social force in history. But in a lot of ways, gunpowder turns out to be a major driving force in a lot of the ways that government functions today. So I want to talk about that. First thing I want to talk about is what were militaries like before gunpowder? And I'm going to stick mostly to Europe here, although you can talk about other militaries. But generally, the core of a pre-gunpowder military was a group of highly trained soldiers. And by highly trained, I don't mean that they worked a lot in the military. I mean that they had a whole lot of skills, such as horseback riding, using bows and arrows and swords on horseback, or on foot. And those are skills that you spend a lifetime perfecting. And they're not things that you can do quickly. You cannot teach someone to really be a really effective horseback rider in just a couple weeks or something like that. And so if you look at the great militaries, they often, the core is often a core of people who have spent their lifetime doing military skills training. And so if you look at a medieval army in Europe, you've got this core of heavily armored knights, right? They're on big horses that have been trained for battle. They have custom-made armor that's been fitted exactly for their bodies. They have spent their lives learning how to ride horses, how to joust, how to fight with swords from horseback, etc. And their whole existence has been geared towards being soldiers, right? Now, outside of that core, you could have other auxiliary troops. You could have archers and longbowmen, you could have pikemen, and these were often not skilled soldiers. The pikemen were usually basically from the peasant class or the urban lower classes, and they got some training, but not much was expected of them, and not much was given to them. And the same with crossbowmen, longbowmen, etc. Now, there were some exceptions to this. The English longbowmen late in the Middle Ages had to spend a fair amount of time mastering a longbow. But for the most part, these peripheral soldiers were not very well trained. They didn't cost a whole lot. They didn't have a lot of custom-made armor. They didn't have horses. They were on foot. And so they were cheap, but they also had very little effect, usually, on battles. And again, the English longbowmen are something of an exception there. And if you look at history, a small number of heavily armored, highly trained knights was really a very effective military tool in the late Middle Ages. If you look at the Crusaders who went to the Holy Land, they were often outnumbered, sometimes 10 to 1, but because they had much bigger horses, were much more heavily armored than their opponents, they were able to basically charge into battle, often at odds of 10 to 1, and they had a fairly good chance of winning. And that was because they had been heavily invested in terms of the horses, in terms of the armor, in terms of the training, etc. And there are occasions in pre-gunpowder history where you'll see a group of people come busting out of nowhere to suddenly conquer huge swaths of territory, and that's often, you think of the Mongols, you think of the Huns, you think of the the Seljuk Turks, etc. That's often because they were groups of people who had a culture built around horseback riding that was essentially a culture that trained lots of young men to be in the skills of warfare, and then they could sort of explode out of nowhere because they had been training soldiers for their whole lives. They just needed organization to really explode into importance. So if you wanted to talk about the sort of core of a pre-gunpowder army, it's often a fairly highly trained and fairly expensive, intensive group of soldiers. And if you want to sum it up, it was quality over quantity. Several thousand heavily armored knights was always going to be able to beat twice as many, untrained peasants with crossbows on a battlefield. And so one of the results of that was that when you looked at armies in the Middle Ages, they were often fairly small. Sometimes over 10,000, but that was that was unusual to get over 10,000. And so if you look at the battles in European history, you know, the battles of the 100 Years' War or something, it was usually no more than 10,000 soldiers on a side. And in fact, the key fighting part of that, for instance, if you look at the Battle of Poitiers-Crécy, the French had lots of crossbowmen, etc., and auxiliary soldiers who didn't even get involved in the battle. The French simply charged with their heavily armored knights, and that was the whole battle. So 2,000 or 3,000 guys were the sort of core of the battle. You get bigger numbers when you get into the Mongols and such, but essentially, there's a limit placed on the size of armies when you need quality, highly trained people, right? Gunpowder changes that because essentially, you know, gunpowder was invented in China and wasn't used militarily for several hundred years. But by the time of the Mongols, they start to use gunpowder in new and exciting ways to sort of create bombs that they could lob over fortifications with catapults and things like that. But the real innovation was by the 1300s, Europeans had gotten a hold of gunpowder and had invented the cannon. And the Turks and Europeans very quickly figured out that gunpowder changed everything. Right? And you saw a whole series of so-called gunpowder empires arise in Persia and in northern India and in the Middle East, and then you saw gunpowder change warfare dramatically in Europe. And the reason that gunpowder changed everything is that essentially you can take a peasant and train him for several weeks to shoot a musket or a cannon, and he can get pretty good at it, right? And once you've trained that peasant for several weeks, a peasant with a musket can take out a heavily armored knight who has thousands of dollars worth of armor on a huge, highly trained and highly bred horse who spent his whole life training to fight. A peasant can take him out with a gun. And so gunpowder tends to automatically then favor quantity over quality, right? Having more badly trained soldiers with guns will often bring you victory over a small number of highly trained soldiers without guns. In fact, almost always. And so this fact, the fact that gunpowder armies can be trained fairly easily, and that gunpowder just sort of magnifies the effect of the number of soldiers. The more soldiers you have, the more bullets there are in the air, the more powerful your army is. With highly trained, pre-gunpowder soldiers, that wasn't always the case. It was often about space on the battlefield, that soldiers on horseback in particular had to have spaces to maneuver and to ride, so often more soldiers was not better. But when you're talking gunpowder, generally speaking, more is better. More is more powerful. And so this changes the dynamic so that governments now have an incentive to build big armies. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that these armies are cheaper. Right? Before, if you look at heavily armored knights with their custom-made armor and their well-bred horses and all of that, a knight is an expensive proposition. And you might say, oh, well, equipping 20 peasants with muskets is cheaper, and in one sense it is, but you have a whole bunch of other costs that are involved, gunpowder and et cetera, and I'll get into more of those costs in a minute. But essentially, once you switch over to a gunpowder army, the central governments have a dynamic that takes over, right? So the first, as I said, is you want quantity over quality. You want to have bigger armies, and they don't have to be that well trained. I mean, a well-trained army is a great thing, and we'll see that discipline really matters in warfare, but the amount of training necessary to put together a pretty good army is less than you would really think. And it's much less than the lifetime it takes to train somebody to ride a horse and fight on horseback. Right? So armies then start to build governments then start to build bigger armies because bigger is better, bigger is more powerful. But this sets in motion another dynamic because although each soldier is cheaper, by the time you start getting 5 times as many soldiers, 10 times as many soldiers, you're starting to get very expensive. You're starting to get bigger and bigger armies. And here's a key thing. Gunpowder armies favor centralized governments. And the reason for that is if you think of France, for instance, in the late Middle Ages, it was a feudal system. where each territory, say, France as a whole was broken up into 6 duchies or something like that, and one duke ran each duchy, and then each duke divided his duchy up into smaller parts and gave it out to counts and viscounts and marquises and things like that. And so you had this sort of hierarchy, although that's probably overstating it, but each nobleman was expected to use the revenue from his territory to arm and equip himself and a small number of soldiers. Right? So if the king of France had to organize a big army, he would call in all of his dukes and say, send me soldiers, and the dukes would call in all their marquises, etc. But each soldier was essentially expected to pay for himself, so to speak. And they set up a system whereby peasants paid aristocrats and seigneurial dues and things to help pay for that in theory. But once you have gunpowder, a marquis simply he can't put together a big army. When armies start getting bigger and bigger, it's only the central government that really has the revenue to put together that big an army. And so once it's about quantity, not quality, it becomes much harder for a local noble to hold out against the central government. The central government becomes has a monopoly on violence because they're the only ones who can put together the resources to put together a really big gunpowder army. Right? The other thing that centralized governments is gunpowder cannons blow through castle walls. And castles had been a great equalizer. A small noble with a castle could hold out against a much bigger military force for a long time. But once you have cannons, castles become far less important. And so that advantage for small nobles also evaporates. So essentially, central governments now become sort of the only game in town. And you see this happen gradually. From the late Middle Ages, when gunpowder is introduced, until the modern era, the 21st century, you see armies get gradually bigger and bigger and bigger. I said in the late Middle Ages, an army was maybe 10,000 soldiers. By the 1700s, you're talking 20, 30, 50,000 soldiers. By the Napoleonic Wars at the late 1700s, early 1800s, you're talking 600,000 soldiers, right? And then you get into World War I and you're talking armies of 9 million. And then you get into World War II and it gets even bigger, and etc. And so armies just keep getting bigger, right? And governments get more centralized. And part of the reason for that is the dynamic of gunpowder. That as armies get bigger, they get more expensive. Right? And so the government that can put twice as much into an army has twice as big an army as a government that can't put that much in. And so government costs start to go up. It becomes a matter of survival. Governments realize they have to put more money into their army because their enemy, when they attack, is going to come at them with a bigger army, and so they have to have a bigger army to confront that. Quantity matters. But if the armies are getting more expensive, you need more revenues, right? You need more taxes. Well, this causes a fundamental shift in government because governments now have to raise more money, right? Before gunpowder, governments often, the king was essentially paying for his own household and a small military force, and he had to maintain some castles and some houses and things like that. But he didn't have, most of the money was going into the king's household. But now, with gunpowder armies, you start to see the gunpowder armies become a bigger and bigger part of government revenues, and this requires governments to start looking for different sources of revenue. Right? Before they could just put a tax on salt and a tax on land and be done with it. Now they really need to extract more money from their own populations. And so governments start to develop tax systems to extract more money from their populations to pay for bigger armies. And so you start having better and better tax records, because if the government can figure out who paid what last time, they can ask that for that much again next time. If the government knows how much this piece of land produced in terms of yield per acre for the last 10 years, they know how much they can expect from that land into the future. And they can go to the owner of that land and say, no, you had this many bushels of wheat last year. We know that's about what you have this year. Pay taxes on that. All right? And then they start looking for other forms of revenue. And you start seeing more and more complicated forms of taxes, right? You start seeing estate taxes, and you start seeing income taxes, and you start seeing all sorts of other ways that the government is trying to find ways to tax people. And a big part of the driver of this, not all of it, but a big part of the driver of this is the needs of military spending. So you need more revenues, and that means you need a tax system, and you need a bureaucracy that can handle the tax system. You need a bunch of bureaucrats keeping records, keeping who paid taxes, who owes taxes, and all that. But the bigger army also creates a second problem, right? When you have an army of 3,000 or 5,000 soldiers on horseback, and it's a pre-gunpowder fight, basically the two armies move around for a while, they run into each other, they have one big battle, and that's it, they're done. But when you have gunpowder armies, first of all, the armies are way bigger. So as they move across the land, it's very difficult for this army to survive on the land it's crossing. You take 600, you take Napoleon's army moving into Russia, 600,000 soldiers, that's a lot of people to feed from the territory you're moving through. And Napoleon found out the hard way, the best way to attack an army like that is simply just deprive it of food. And so as armies get bigger and bigger, they start to get more logistical requirements. They need food. You need to make sure there's food for an army that big. But also, you need to make sure there's gunpowder for a gunpowder army. Gunpowder has to be kept dry, so you have to have a pretty good supply system and transportation system to provide enough gunpowder to supply an army of 600,000 men. And then you need bullets, and with gunpowder armies and so many armies moving around, you often need uniforms, so everybody knows who to shoot and who not to shoot. Right? And so now you've got to have uniforms, and you've got to have other forms of equipment. You've got to have belts, you got to have cartridge, belts and things like that. You need to have powder horns or what have you. You need ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. So you start to see that gunpowder armies have this sort of supply trail behind them in a way that other armies before gunpowder didn't. Okay? And then, of course, you can take this one step farther back still. If a government knows they're going to need this much gunpowder, you have to make that, which means they're going to need this much saltpeter and this much sulfur and et cetera. They need the raw materials, and if they're going to need this much ammunition, they're going to need that much lead. So they'd better have lead, mining production. And so government as they start to realize they have to supply these huge armies, government starts to get really more and more involved in the economy. Because they need to make sure they have supplies of all this stuff. If they're going to need all those uniforms, they have to make sure the economy has the capacity to produce those uniforms, has the right amounts of fabric, dyes, etc. And so government gets more and more involved in manufacturing to supply this huge army. Right? That doesn't mean the government is doing the manufacturing itself, although sometimes that is exactly the case. But the government is concerned about manufacturing. It has to make sure it can supply all this stuff. And of course that means more bureaucracy, right? Because now you've got people having to handle industrial policy and keeping track of industrial production and mines production and et cetera. And then, pretty big, government starts to say, well, where are we going to get the soldiers, right? Where are we going to get 600,000 soldiers? And they begin to realize that, and by this time we're getting into the late 19th, early 20th century, that government now has a vested interest. Armies are getting so big after the Napoleonic Wars. The government has a vested interest in making sure that the population as a whole can produce enough soldiers who are healthy enough to do the job they need to do. And in particular, the World Wars are a huge point in this process, because during the World Wars, the American government, the French government, the German government, etc., they drafted or inducted all these men into the military, and we're talking militaries of millions of men, and they discovered that lots of them had health problems. They were malnourished, they had bad teeth, they had flat feet, they had ringworm, they had hookworm, etc., etc. They had all sorts of problems, tuberculosis, etc. And so they began to realize that to field a good army, they, to a certain extent, had to have a good, healthy population. And that's when you start to see governments turning to physical fitness programs to create the next generation. One of the first was the Boy Scouts, who were basically created by Lord Baden-Powell to provide the British with a good colonial stock of men who could go conquer Africa and Asia. They wanted to make sure they were healthy enough and comfortable enough out in the woods and could hike and etc. But by World War I, the American government realized in particular they had a whole lot of people who really weren't healthy enough to be soldiers. And so in the United States, the government, the military and the U.S. government as a whole began to push for more physical fitness, both by doing what we'd call propaganda, public relations campaigns to convince people to do more physical fitness, but also in terms of government funding for public education, et cetera. And I'm oversimplifying here, but the reason you do Phi-Ed in high school and in elementary school is because the military needs soldiers, right? And that's an oversimplification, but that's part of the process. And then you also got the fact that in World War I, the U.S. military does IQ tests for the first time, and they're horrified by what they find. And so the U.S. government then also says, well, if we really want soldiers we can use, soldiers who can read orders, soldiers who can figure out trajectories, soldiers who can handle logistics, we need educated soldiers. And part of the push for public education, both in Europe and in the United States, has been because of the need for at least moderately educated, competent people who could be turned into soldiers, right? And so by this point you can see how the government has expanded in many ways simply to serve the military. And let me give you one final example. One reason the United States has such an enormous interstate highway system is because Dwight Eisenhower in World War I was in the military, and he was part of a troop transport that drove across the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast, and he was horrified by the quality of the roads, and he realized this was actually a military issue if the United States ever had to defend itself against an invasion. And so when Eisenhower was president in the 1950s, he was a keen advocate for building a interstate highway system that would allow for the quick transport of American military units across the country by having good roads all ready for them that were high-speed roads. But they even went farther, because one of the things that they don't talk about much is the U.S. military always knows, they always have plans that show how wide every interstate highway is, and they had input in the specifications for the interstate highway system because they saw all those interstate highways as potential emergency landing strips. If they needed to fight across America, the interstate highway system would provide a ready-made series of basically landing strips if they needed them. So you have infrastructure, you have public education, you have public health programs, you have tax revenue programs, you have industrial policies, you have a big bureaucracy to handle all of those things. And ultimately what you can see then is that for governments, gunpowder armies, because they constantly get bigger and bigger, because quantity matters more than quality, gunpowder armies tend to just get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And that drives the growth of government over time. One final point, though, is that if you look at the last 40 or 50 years, one of the things you'll see is that we are now getting smart weapons, drones that fly with themselves essentially, and bombs that can target and track things themselves, and airplanes that are better and better and tanks that have computer guided targeting systems and such. One of the things you're seeing now is the technology has advanced so far that you actually need fewer people to operate enormous amounts of technology and to cause enormous amounts of destruction, because one fighter plane or one fighter bomber can cause enormous amounts of destruction now, whereas it would have taken a dozen airplanes to do the same amount of destruction in World War II. That means 1/12 as many pilots. But all the driving forces for the size of government are still there in the sense, because the government is just spending more and more on weapons systems. It's not spending as much on people anymore, but it's spending more and more on weapons systems. And so the U.S. government budget for the military continues to grow. And in many ways, the size of the government is driven by the size of the military.